I'm Mark Milstein. I'm a director of the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise over at the Johnson School here at Cornell University, and I've been asked to moderate the panel this afternoon. The panel title is Energy, Security, Sustainability, and Environmental Law, which means we can talk about everything under the sun. As the event goes on, and as the keynote speaker was really focused on, the event as a whole is looking at a lot of local upstate issues, particularly around hydrofracking and shale gas. This panel is a little bit different. It's not that we're not going to cover that topic, but we're doing so in the context of bigger questions around global energy needs, global energy supply and demand. And so what I'm going to, how I'm going to run this panel is we've got 5 great panelists here. Rick Allmendinger, William Boyd, Jeff Clark, Wes Sine, and Jeff Tester. I'm going to ask each of them to take just a couple of minutes, 2 to 3. That's 2 to 3, Jeff Tester. Okay, just seeing if you're listening. 2 to 3 minutes to tell you who they are, what they do, and give a little bit of a sense of where they're coming from, generally speaking on the topic. Then I'm going to ask a few questions that I prepared ahead of time. I shared them with these guys ahead of time to start thinking about broad topics to get the conversation flowing. From there, it's an interactive session. I'm going to turn to the audience. We want your questions, and I will moderate that discussion. Because of the setup of the room, we don't have a mobile mic. We only have the mic down here in the front. So I'll tell people when we're going to get close to moving towards questions from the audience, and if you can work your way up towards the mic, then I'll ask you to put a question forward. Typical rules or requests are that questions, make sure they end with a question mark, not declarative statements. Let's keep a conversation going. It's hard to react to declarative statements. Much better to do a question, much better if the question is short and to the point so that we can give the panelists a chance to share their thoughts with us. So with that, Rick, do you want to start us off?
Yes, the mic is working. I'm Rick Allmendinger. I'm a professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Cornell. I'm also an associate dean in the College of Engineering and a faculty fellow of the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. So I would guess I'm certainly in a minority here of being a person who has actually knowingly walked on outcrops of the Marcellus, looked at them, collected samples, made measurements and things like that. So I bring my geologist perspective to this whole debate about shale gas. And part of that perspective, frankly, is global, because energy is a global topic. Now, all of the issues that Susan Christopherson addressed earlier are incredibly important, and the questions that she raised, it's important that we get those right. But we also need to look at energy from a global point of view. Let me say at the start that I have no financial interest. I don't have any grants or contracts or leases of personal property in shale gas or anything like that. I have consulted for major oil companies in the past. Several of my students work for oil companies. But I can also tell you that climate change is the real deal, and we have to pay attention to both simultaneously. So the main message that I hope that you take away from my comments is that you can't look at any energy source today in isolation, because out of context and in isolation, they all look bad, or they all look risky. There is no such thing as a totally benign, no impact energy source. They're either bad for the environment, or they're bad for global climate change, or they're bad for your wallet, or they're bad for human health. So instead, what you have to do when you're making choices about energy, you have to look at your choices in the context of realistic choices. So just as an example, the most benign fossil fuels, and about 90% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, the most benign ones, conventional oil and gas, are those deposits that have been concentrated into a reservoir and are therefore fairly easy to extract. They are at or close to peak production, and they will diminish over the years as worldwide energy consumption increases. So over the next few decades, as we hopefully have a plan for transitioning to green energy sources, and as they become more economically viable, We will only meet the world energy demand by using unconventional hydrocarbons. Unconventional hydrocarbons have higher environmental impact, larger carbon footprint because they are not concentrated into reservoirs. They are diffused throughout the rock, and therefore the technologies that you need to get them out are necessarily more invasive. But not having energy to do what we want to do is not an option. So we have to figure out how to manage this transition. And I'll pass the microphone on from there.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thanks also to Ben and to the Environmental Law Society for hosting this conference and inviting me. It's a great opportunity for me. I'm William Boyd. I'm a law professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I teach environmental law, energy law, and climate change law and policy. And I'm also a fellow at the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, which is a new institute between NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and the University of Colorado Boulder. And we're actually beginning or contemplating a major study on the role of natural gas in the transition or the potential for shale gas in particular and its impacts on the electric power sector. So I'm very excited to be here in the middle of this quite complex and interesting energy landscape. This emerging energy economy, and really expect to learn quite a bit over the next couple of days, and would be very interested in talking to people who are interested in getting involved in this larger effort. My priors. I practiced energy and environmental law for a big DC law firm for a while, and was then, before that, I was counsel to the Democratic minority staff of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. It seems like a long time ago, but the same sort of issues that seem to be coming up today in terms of the Clean Air Act and whether the EPA is going too far or not far enough, we're very much on the agenda back then as well. I also did a PhD in an interdisciplinary program at University of California, Berkeley, the Energy and Resources Group, which was started by John Holdren, who's the current science advisor to President Obama. And the basic premise of that program was that you can't really understand energy and environmental issues right from a single perspective or a single discipline, that you need engineering, you need environmental science, you need economics, you need policy and law, which is obviously a lot for any person to do, but I think argues for multidisciplinary team-based approaches to sort of thinking through some of these very complex problems. And my view is that energy is the hardest part of the environment problem, and environment is the hardest part of the energy problem. We're not running out of energy, but we are running out of cheap, easily available energy, and we are running out of environment, right? We're running out of the absorptive capacity of the environment in a global scale and at local and regional scales to deal with the impacts of energy use, right? And so finding sort of smart ways to chart the transition, to regulate, to govern the energy transitions, and we seem to be at the beginning of a pretty important energy transition, right, is quite important. There is tremendous inertia in the current energy system that is dedicated to extracting fossil hydrocarbons and providing the fuel for our everyday lives. There's something like $13 trillion invested in the global energy system in terms of fixed capital investments, and very long turnover times, 30 to 40-year turnover times for many of these big lumpy investments. So this doesn't turn over overnight. It's going to take a very long time to chart and initiate and complete the transition to perhaps a low-carbon energy economy. But at the same time, there's tremendous momentum in the climate system, right? We're locked into a certain amount of warming. We're on emissions pathways that don't show any indication that they're starting to bend down in any significant way going forward. And that is locking us into potential and future disruptions in the climate system that could have dramatic impacts. And so finding a way to sort of balance those and figuring out a way to chart a path forward, it seems to me there's a very important role for government and regulation and law and lawyers to play in all of that. And the last thing I would say is, you know, this is sort of a global big picture panel, it seems to me, but I was struck by the comments that Susan made in the keynote. At the end of the day, this is very much about real people, real places, real communities that are getting pulled into these transitions in very important ways. And I really commend the organizers of the conference for keeping this grounded in a real energy economy. So thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm Jeff Clark, and I'm happy to be here. I'm glad that Ben and his colleagues in this class invited me. And I am a partner at a Washington, D.C. law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, where I've really spent, with the exception of my time in the law at the Justice Department, which I'll mention in a minute, at Kirkland & Ellis. And that's in the Washington, D.C. office. I do a lot of environmental law, across a lot of different media, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act is probably where my greatest expertise is, and a lot of other statutes as well. But I really still continue to think of myself, despite that, as a generalist. I do a lot of general appellate litigation and administrative law, and Washington, D.C. is the place to do that, and I'm sure there's some law students here. And if you're good at administrative law, the lingua franca of the administrative state, D.C. is probably the best place to be for that, although there's a fair amount of it going on, especially on an increasing basis across the country. I spent 4 years, from 2001 to 2005, as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Environment and Natural Resources Division, or ENRD, at the Justice Department, one of the 6 litigating divisions within Main Justice. There I had charge of the appellate section, so I worked on all of the cases in the federal circuit spread all across the country for that period of time. Wrote briefs, oversaw briefs, approved or rejected briefs, worked with all the cases that went up to the Supreme Court in that time period with the SG's office, which the law students probably know, handle those cases at the Supreme Court, that element of the Justice Department. And also the Indian Resources section, and I did a fair amount of work on Indian land claims cases in this area. So as I was driving around here, I was hearing advertisements for the local casino. So I'd just encountered that really before on paper, so now I actually have a connection to it. I also serve as an adjunct professor at the George Mason Law School, where I've taught for about 10 or 11 years, either administrative law, environmental law, or law, science and technology, a seminar that a partner of mine and I run. So my perspective is, probably aligned at some level with industry perspectives on these matters. Although I will say that in terms of your particular interest in this conference in hydrofracking, I don't have any clients in the natural gas industry. I'm not working on hydrofracking. So my exposure to the issue is from reading about it and just generally being aware of developments in environmental law. So with that, by way of background out of the way, let me just make a couple points, and I'm sure I can work other ones in to the answers to questions and to the back and forth, which I'm sure all of you are looking forward to. That you find myself on a panel which has sustainability in the title, and first thing I'd probably throw out to my fellow panelists is to define for me what the term sustainability means. It's something that kind of leaves me scratching my head, feels like a code word to me. And I'll explore my views on that more in a little bit. But to me, markets are inherently sustainable, right? If oil prices go up because oil supplies are running out, then that sends a signal throughout the market economy to find some substitute for it. And that's exactly what industry does and does best. So I don't see, I'm not fond of government schemes that try to guess what the right substitute should be. I think market participants do a lot better job of that on a decentralized basis than the government does in trying to pick winners and losers. I also think that subsidy systems, and that's functionally what I think all of the renewable energy things are about, either by penalizing conventional sources of energy, so-called conventional sources of energy with taxes or regulations, or directly subsidizing their alternatives, those systems are unsustainable, in particular when we're in a massive budget crisis, not just on the federal level, but on the state level. You can't continue to subsidize something that's not inherently economical. And if you look at the data on the relative prices to generate, say, a kilowatt hour of electricity using coal or using natural gas as compared to doing those same things with wind power or solar, the numbers are really, the delta between those is really just off the charts. And then maybe 2 other points and I'll just stop. One is I think we really need at this point pro-energy policy in America. I think we have a massive energy sector, a Gulliver, and a new Gulliver in shale deposits that tied up or potentially about to be tied up by 1,000 or 1,000,000 little Lilliputian regulations. And I think that, given particularly the economy and the situation we find ourselves in, I think that there needs to be a reevaluation of where the growth of regulations from the 70s forward has brought us. And then the last point is, on hydrofracking, there's a big myth out there that it's not subject to any federal regulations, which is not true. NEPA is probably a gigantic rope, or there's a gigantic, well, there's a double the normal size Lilliputian with a NEPA helmet on that can tie down almost anything. And I think we should think about something like a free enterprise zone for something like fracking and seeing where that takes us. But if you're not interested in something like that at a federal level, it seems to me that it is inherently a local issue. And that's why I think there are probably so many people here in the auditorium. If New York State decides, if its voters decide that they don't want to have fracking, that's their prerogative, it seems to me. If another state in competition with that decides that they would like to have it, that's the way I think our federalist system is designed and the way it functions best. Then I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Wes?
My name is Wesley Sine. I'm a professor at the Johnson School of Business. I come from to this conference from an angle of representing entrepreneurs and innovators, and spent a lot of time looking at technology innovation in the sector, and more than anything, the social drivers of innovation. And I have, if I'm going to say anything about my experience, it'll be very brief, and that is that I think we need to look at costs and benefits as a moving target. What we know about innovation is the scale and rate of innovation changes, and if we just, Jeff brought up wind power, if we look at the speed of change or the drop in prices of wind power versus other kinds of electricity generation technologies, it's very steep. And we see this across all kinds of technologies in and out of the power industry. Power industry is just one example of how we need to think about innovation as a moving target, and that we, in a sense, have some degree of control over how fast innovation moves forward in any particular technology and any particular sector. I'm not saying to my fellow hard scientists that there aren't really objective obstacles. There's also a big, there's a deterministic influence we can have as policymakers and as voters. So again, I interviewed thousands of entrepreneurs in this sector, and that's my point of view. And just on the delta between, just getting to Jeff, between wind power and coal power, new wind and new coal, it's not that big of a difference right now. Old coal, new wind, it's a big difference, but not new coal, new wind.
Okay, and Jeff.
My name is Jeff Tester, and I'm currently the Kroll Professor of Sustainable Energy Systems and also a professor in chemical engineering here at Cornell. I serve also as director of the newly established Cornell Energy Institute and associate director for energy in the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. I've been only at Cornell now about 2 years, so it should be helpful perhaps to reflect a little bit on my background before that. I spent a large part of my professional career at MIT and directed MIT's Energy Lab for 12 years while I was there. And prior to that, was involved with geothermal development in the American West in what has now being called the enhanced or engineered geothermal energy system approach to drilling and stimulating deep zones of hot rock to create artificial geothermal systems. So I know a little bit about fracturing and a little bit about drilling, and it's in that context that I carry out some of the research that I'm doing here at Cornell. But reflecting a little bit on what I've heard so far, I think that it's important to point out that we really need to think about what energy provides for us and the services it provides and how that's connected to our social, economic, and environmental well-being today. We have to have energy to heat our homes and to condition buildings, to move people around and to perform industrial processes. Where this energy comes from, many are arguing will have to change as we move through this next century. And it seems to me if we're going to have both national, regional, and international energy policies, we have to think about what would be the ingredients of trying to make such a transition. Besides enabling new understanding, this is a university, and generating new ideas and having the kind of research and development support that you'd expect to kind of give you good options, I think we should always insist on full life cycle assessment, where the externalities of some of our current energy systems are actually factored into that life cycle assessment and included in the cost. So the internalization, if you will, of environmental externalities is often not done today. So full life cycle assessment, providing incentives, whether they're policy incentives or others, that would encourage the deployment of more sustainable energy systems. And sustainability is a word with many definitions. It's connected to values. It's also connected to environmental performance, engineering performance, and economic performance. The final sort of area has to do with deploying, in my mind, what I'll call a robust regulatory system that ensures that best practices would be followed in all aspects of any energy development, including the performance of the system from an interconversion efficiency point of view, as well as improving and maintaining environmental stewardship. This isn't always so easy to get consensus on, and often among stakeholders, it's difficult to reach even a rational thinking on what we might do with shale gas. We certainly haven't succeeded on doing this at a national scale at all. So if we're going to choose among options, often the low-cost path is selected for the short term without much attention given to the full impacts, benefits, and costs of alternatives over the longer term or over their total life cycle. To make the so-called right choice from a sustainability perspective, it's necessary to understand the differences between short and long-term effects associated with shale gas in this case, and to look at pluses and minuses in the context of how advocates or adversaries are weighting them. To achieve acceptable endpoints and performance goals, trade-offs have to be a part of the dialogue. They should be evaluated accounting for both uncertainties and risks for all options. This is almost never done by individuals, local officials, federal policymakers. When it comes to making choices, they often choose to mitigate the risk by opposing one change for another and not considering alternatives in that context. I think I'll stop here and we'll go into the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks guys. So the first question is very broad, and you know, feel free to jump in on this as you see fit. But it's been difficult domestically to get any consistency on energy and climate change policy in the U.S. And in the midst of what appears to be another oil price spike and nuclear challenge in Japan, do you see the bigger shifts? Do you see bigger shifts on the landscape on these issues, or are things just still continuing do you think they're continuing the way they have been? Any one of you can jump in.
I'll jump in with a legal angle on that. I think part of the reason why there's a consistency problem relates to how the Massachusetts versus EPA case came out in the Supreme Court. And that's the case about whether EPA should have granted a petition for emission standards from new motor vehicles for greenhouse gases. The Bush administration's EPA denied that petition, and the Supreme Court reversed that denial, and there's been a lot of fighting about what that means exactly. But I think if you look at things from a Democratic standpoint, a major run was pushed by President Obama. It was one of his top two, I think, after health care legislative initiatives. He got it through the House. He failed to get it through the Senate. To me, the results there with the American people should stand, and the agency should not be engaged, that EPA shouldn't be engaged in trying to overturn the will of Congress there. Ben will probably have some debate, at least with my law professor colleague, perhaps, about the meaning of the Supreme Court case. But I think if that case was dealt with fairly by the administration, then I think after they made their attempt to get a cap and trade regime put in place and lost, then we'd have a consistent energy policy based on the outcome and the will of the American people.
I guess I've been baited. Just give me a heads up if the Lilliputians come running through the door. They're all here. Okay. Whose side are you on? I don't know if I want to, I had some other comments. I'll say a little bit about Mass v. EPA. I mean, it seems to me EPA's hands are somewhat tied, obviously, once they've made the endangerment finding in going forward, both with mobile sources and with stationary sources under the PSD program. And I see this EPA and this administration sort of bending over backwards to try to provide sort of flexibility and perhaps delay in terms of when those regulations would take effect. The tailoring rule is a pretty good example. I certainly agree that the Clean Air Act is not, or was not designed and is not optimal in terms of climate policy and dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. But the wheels are turning, and that's a fact on the landscape that we've got to deal with. The fact that Waxman-Markey made it through the House and then died in the Senate seems to me is hardly a judgment on the Clean Air Act and EPA. And it may be that we don't have much in the way of greenhouse gas regulations under the Clean Air Act after the current budget negotiations and the continuing resolution. We'll see. All of that seems to be on the table right now. But I want to go back to the general question here, and I think this does go to your general point, is that climate change as an issue seems to be the sort of persona non grata right now in the policy debate in Washington. I tell my children that it is the equivalent of he who shall not be named, right? And we can't talk about climate change anymore, right? We have to talk about clean energy and green jobs, because there's a lot of upside with clean energy and green jobs, right? And climate change is really complicated, scary, the looming threat facing civilization. It's all about cost, it's all downside. But if we somehow sever or decouple those discussions, it seems to me we've made a huge mistake, right? We've got to integrate our thinking about climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not to mention adaptation and all of the other issues on the table, with our discussion of energy policy and thinking about energy transitions. And let me just say something about, and of course I recognize though the art of the possible, having worked in Washington and worked on the Hill, is shrinking by the day here. And in a fiscal crisis, I certainly recognize that the art of the possible perhaps shrinks to some sort of singularity. But we do need to recognize that getting something going and moving, right, is really important, and perhaps a clean energy standard with some additional new legislation on fuel economy is a place to start. I don't see climate legislation coming down the pike anytime soon, just because of the politics, if anything. California seems to be moving ahead. They've got some litigation challenges that they're grappling with as well. On the oil price spike, it seems to me we're stuck with high prices for oil going forward, and this is a good example of where the market, right, will actually have quite an impact. The price signal will have an impact going forward, no doubt about that. But that's a reality, it seems to me, unless we have another major economic downturn. In terms of nuclear, though, there will be, it seems to me, additional costs for licensing new nuclear power plants in the United States associated with what happened in Japan, just because of additional reviews and perhaps new licensing requirements on the margin. At the end of the day, though, the economics of nuclear are fairly dismal in the United States, especially given where the price of gas is. So you can go and talk to John Rowe at Exelon, the largest merchant nuclear generator in the country, or others, and they say, we're not going to build any new nuclear for a couple of decades as long as gas is where it is. It just, the finance, right, the economic side of this doesn't make any sense to us. Despite the loan guarantees, despite the risk insurance, despite all of the other subsidies that the industry's been getting for some time. So that leaves you with, right, big utilities in cost of service regimes basically down south, right? Duke, Southern, Entergy, where they've already gone to their local legislators and gotten automatic prudence determinations for new investments, and they're big enough where they can potentially finance one of these. But even these guys are a bit nervous about this because we haven't done this in a very long time. So I think my view is nuclear should absolutely be on the table. It's very important. Everything should be on the table. But just to maintain the 20% of U.S. electricity that currently comes from nuclear is going to be a tall order, right? Because we have an aging fleet as it is. And given the economics of it and the gas price, right, the fact that we are looking at fairly low prices going forward if this shale gas revolution materializes, et cetera, then it seems to me the economics are quite difficult for the industry for some time. So maybe we get 2 or 3 new units through the licensing process and built out sometime in the 2020s, right? That's nowhere near what we need if we want this to be a larger and larger share of the electricity mix. The last thing I'll say is, and I think this goes to the conference, is energy politics in this country have been dominated sort of by regional politics as much as anything for a very long time. And what's interesting about shale gas is that starts to change the regional politics of energy to some extent in the same way that renewables is also changing the regional politics of energy as well. And so new constituencies, it seems to me, are lining up around different energy sources and thinking about this energy transition, which is going to make I think the climate in Washington quite tricky to predict going forward.
So I'm gonna tack with the question then a little bit, because the 2 responses there started us in the legal political realm. The William, what I heard you go towards is you started looking at the private sector perspectives and the dynamics in there. And recently I've spent time at 2 great American institutions, the Pentagon and Goldman Sachs. And both of them have been talking about emerging energy technologies. That's what the conversations have been focused on. Both seem driven more on supporting the development of new low carbon or carbon-free technologies than I'd say the country as a whole is, both those institutions. Both are looking beyond petroleum-based energy sources, even while we're wrestling locally with this idea of unconventional hydrocarbons like gas shale. So are these institutions crazy? Are we crazy locally? Or are they visionary leaders? Are we missing something? And I open that up to the whole panel to comment on.
I'll comment. So I think the big investment banks, the venture capitalists, the private equity funds, they're looking at the pace of change, of innovation. They look at the oil and gas industry and they see a line that looks like this. And they look at the renewable industry, they see a line like this. That is the change year over year in the efficiency of the technology is moving very quickly. So, so I think they're saying the future, long-term future and medium-term future, is probably going to be, and which particular technology, there's a lot of questions, nobody really knows, but there's a lot of positive change. So for their dollar, I'm not talking about the Pentagon necessarily, I think they're more about energy security. But in terms of the big investors of the world, or at least the United States, they're saying if we want to get a real strong return on our long-term investments, those are the sectors we have to watch very carefully. That said, surely as some of these new technologies for drilling for gas become more refined, I think my guess is, and I think it's a lot of people's guesses, we're going to see short-term, maybe medium-term investments flowing in and out, and people are going to make some money. But like the big kinds of returns the venture capitalists are looking for, the private equity investors are looking for, 5x, 6x, they're looking at, again, these steep innovation curves that they see in the alternative energy sector. So in terms of the Pentagon, I think they just don't want to be stuck in war without enough energy, right? And so it becomes an issue of national defense. But I think that's for pretty long-term thinking. Right? I don't think we're going to run out of gas for the tanks in the near future. But apparently it happened to Venezuela a few years ago that they actually didn't have enough refined gas to get their tanks into Colombia. So, but we're not anywhere near that right now.
Rick, were you going to?
Well, I was just going to chime in. Geologists have a very different perspective on time than almost any other living creature.
So long-term for me is...
So long-term for me is quite different, but that's one of the major issues in the debate, and it's only organizations and institutions which can afford to think in long term, and in long term in this case, I mean on the order of decades, who are beginning to look 2 decades, 3 decades out and looking at the panorama. And as Wes said, the growth curve over that time interval is going to be huge. I did want to say something about nuclear, again, from a geological perspective. Certainly the crisis in Japan, and it is certainly a crisis, has changed the public's perception of nuclear, which was slowly creeping back into potential acceptability. I will point out, I'm not necessarily in favor of nuclear as a long-term solution, but I will point out that we had just one of the most catastrophic events that the world could throw at a nuclear power plant that was built 4 or 5 decades ago, and it hasn't killed anybody. Coal-fired power plants kill tens of thousands of people every single year, and so on. So we need to take realistic approaches to risk when we look at these technologies, and so on. The biggest risks are frankly financial. What do you invest in, and will you back the right horse in this debate?
Just three quick things. One of which is kind of a quip. I think in the geological long term, we're all dead. To quote Keynes.
We're all dinosaurs.
And that lets me seg actually into how I think the current administration's energy policy really, while purportedly their economic strategy is Keynesian, right, to the gigantoid stimulus and so on, the regulatory approach, the number of regulations coming out of the administration, and particularly EPA, is really unprecedented, and their size is unprecedented, and it really goes beyond the absorptive capacity of the national economy to take. And from that perspective, I puzzle and give a lot of speeches where I sort of spot the point that the regulatory policy pulls in exactly the opposite direction by imposing taxes on the economy that the stimulus does. But to answer your more direct question, I think I would say in terms of the financial sector and their interest in this, and I'll be, I'll say one good thing and one bad thing. This is the folks essentially who brought us the mortgage crisis and bubble, and before that, the bubble in computer, tech stocks and those kinds of issues. But I think that in part it's an issue of looking forward to the curve and people who are sort of looking for big returns. I think that's definitely part of it. So I don't want to be unfair, but I also think part of it is rent-seeking behavior. Especially with the cap and trade situation, there were firms that were lined up to make a killing off of that thing, essentially, based on their unholy alliances, in my view, with sectors of industry that stood to gain if cap and trade passed. And I think that I wish at some level our financial elites had, a more broad perspective on things, and that they looked out for the national interest as opposed to the interest of the particular, clients or particular ways they might make killings.
And I'd love it if folks who want to jump into the conversation and join, will work their way to the mic. We'll get to you soon. Were you going to say something, Jeff?
Well, I just a simple comment while we're waiting for the transition. These to a certain extent, certainly Goldman Sachs and others like them, are portfolio managers, right? And energy does represent a portfolio of options, and there are a lot of reasons why we might want to achieve change. And I view climate change as one indicator, but there are at least a dozen indicators that I frequently talk to our students and others about that why we ought to be thinking hard about change. And there is something between a time scale of 1 congressional quarter and 1,000,000 years, namely the lifetimes of our children, grandchildren, and their children, and the intergenerational responsibility that goes with that. So that does allow us to make some directional changes that would make a difference. And I think that's important as an engineer to recognize, but it has to be viable. It has to be acceptable economically and socially and politically, and we haven't really come to grips with that yet as a nation.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I have a question concerning an alternative energy, which has come to a little bit of renown here at Cornell simply because of an argument between a chief proponent of this type and Professor David Pimentel at Cornell here. Some of you may have heard about this. I didn't actually attend this, and I'm a little bit behind on a lot of the material. However, the book is called Alcohol Can Be a Gas by David Bloom, who happens to be in Santa Cruz. DVDs have been sent my way and may now be at my neighbor's house, because I called them to get them here for this, and unfortunately I was going to give them to you people. Maybe can't get them right away, but who knows. Anyway, this is a possibility of actually, and it should not be considered a joke, even though it may sound hippie-like, of creating alcohol as a possible way of motivating us down the road and creating energy for heating and lighting and almost anything you need. It can be done on a small scale or large scale. It can sustain and be produced by local people agriculturally here in New York State and almost anywhere. You can use corn, but that's not the efficient way to do it because you only get about 250 gallons per acre. But it can be done by other things, which brings the rate of return up to, say, 700 or 800 or 900 gallons per acre. I wonder if any of you have heard of this. Do you know anything about it? Would you be willing to look into it if you haven't heard about it? Because we really need to consider this. We shouldn't act as though it's by some stupid hippie out there. This book is entirely comprehensive, dealing from the agriculture to all the technology to altering your car to do it. It's been done in Brazil. We have flex fuel cars out there right now made by various people. Most people don't even know they have a flex fuel car. You can put.
So let me cut in there and say, the question as I'm hearing it is, biofuels in their range, what's their role? Jeff.
So biofuels are a remarkable example, or biomass to bioenergy and fuels is a remarkable example of the kind of options this country has. Unfortunately, some of the early development, which David Pimentel is referring to, has to do with let's say less than perfect efficiency, far from perfect efficiency of taking corn grain and converting it to ethanol. Ethanol, though, as a single solution, I think would make a mistake because biomass has many other uses as well. We could go more directly to gasoline or diesel-grade fuels that we have an infrastructure for already and not require flexible fuel vehicles. We have a lot of vehicles on the ground in the country, and it'll take a while to achieve that transition. In addition, it can be gasified. And gas, whether it's syngas or methane, would have if it came from a biological source or a biomass source, would clearly have a different sort of footprint than a fossil or depletable resource. So I think it needs to be looked at. But remember what I said about life cycle analysis and sort of a careful quantitative look into looking at what one promoter or one advocate may say about this is the solution to what really might be the case. And I think looking at net energy efficiency and all of the attributes that go with biomass need to be looked at carefully. I think it is a good idea in certain parts of the country, but like shale gas or any other alternative, it's got to be done correctly where these risks and uncertainties are weighed in the balance. Good point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, recently I've talked to entrepreneurs in Brazil, Colombia, Canada, United States, working on these kinds of, each one with their own different focus. And they're having a hard time making it work, but they are true believers. They think they're going to make it work, and they think it's going to make the world a better place and their children rich. So to be continued. I just think that's one of many interesting approaches, and as Jeff mentioned, there's different ways of doing it, right? Whether you go to syngas, which I think is less popular right now, or using other kinds of technologies and techniques. And the plants they're using, the plant I visited in Colombia was using something I'd never seen before. So, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, and it's a good thing. And I think the extent to which governments can help take some of the barriers away from these early entrepreneurs, either by working with them to create better regulatory kinds of structures or direct subsidies. I think that's, in the long run, it's a good thing because you just don't know who to bet on. So you have to make a more generalized kind of bet.
William, and then I'm going to take the next question.
I'll just say something very briefly. One, Jeff's point about life cycle analysis seems to me is very important when we look at different biofuels, and specifically the greenhouse gas emissions profile, and looking at both direct and indirect emissions from land use change associated with allocating significant acreages to biofuels, and there's been a bunch of work on this. The water footprint's also very important, and people really haven't spent a lot of time looking at that. Two, if you want to scale biofuels, right, if you want biofuels to make a big, scalable impact on the greenhouse gas emissions picture, right, and effort, it seems to me you're talking about potentially rearranging a significant chunk of global agriculture and devoting a significant chunk of arable land, I've seen figures as high as 20%, right, to biofuels production, which raises food security issues. So the scale question, it seems to me, is a really important one with biofuels, and maybe there are new technologies, algae, whatever, coming down the pike that will mitigate some of that. But it's a really important issue, and the politics of this blew up a few years ago and then sort of subsided a bit as commodity prices declined. Commodity prices are clearly going back up now, in part because of the price of oil, but that, right, as we see these biofuels mandates in Europe and the US really kick in, it's going to be back on the table for sure.
Can I just respond, Mark? Sorry. I just want to say one thing to William's comment, and that is, I completely agree, but I think one of the problems when we look at biofuels is that people say, will it be the solution? I don't think there's going to be the solution. Like I said, I just got back from Colombia. There's big tracts of land that are now becoming available. Paramilitaries used to rule, and they want to put these into, the vice president of the country wants to put this into use for biofuels. For them, it's a great solution.
No, and I totally agree with that. And for Brazil, I do a bunch of work in Brazil. The best thing we could do for Brazil and for biofuels is to get rid of the tariff on Brazilian sugar-based ethanol coming into the United States. That's a really good, sustainable source of biofuel.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm with Earthworks Oil and Gas Accountability Project, so we don't take the perspective that it's federal regulations around the necks of industry, but rather the loopholes in federal regulation that's around the necks of impacted communities. So with that in mind, I was wondering if some of you could comment on how, if we were to be able to get rid of the enormous loopholes in key provisions of 7 major environmental laws that the oil and gas industry alone enjoys, how that would impact the outlook for natural gas, either in relationship to other sources, leveling the playing field, encouraging better practices, changing the price outlook, et cetera. It's a question I get asked a lot, and I'd love to know what all of you think. Thank you.
Yeah, I know earlier, Jeff, you brought up a role that you saw subsidies playing on renewables. To a layman like me, I hear, I've got this perception of a lot of loopholes available to oil and gas industry. What is the reaction there in terms of what loopholes are out there that can be closed? How much do they really affect things? And is that focusing too much on small issues when some of these bigger issues that you've raised collectively I'm talking the whole panel, not just Jeff.
Well, I'll start out then. I think that there are certainly, and I do represent some folks in that industry, and so I'm not going to name any names or name any particular exclusions, but I'll try to show you that I'm being fair-minded. I'm an opponent of subsidies. Generally, I'm an opponent of regulatory loopholes as opposed to an even playing field for industries across different media and across different technologies or approaches that they're using. That being said, though, there are a number of situations which are characterized, I think mischaracterized, as loopholes that aren't loopholes because there are oil and gas specific regulatory regimes that other industries don't have to deal with that need to be taken into account. So yes, as a general fan of free markets, I think there should be, when there is regulation to account for market failures, there should be level regulatory playing fields. But I do think that this issue gets demagogued a fair amount and things are characterized as loopholes without looking holistically at where there's other forms of regulation that applies only to that industry.
William?
All I can say is that I think it's a really important empirical question. I don't know that anybody knows the answer. So if we get legislation, say after this EPA study runs its course in 4 or 5 years from now, we see new legislation that closes some of these loopholes. It's a big question, it seems to me, is what that does to the cost of producing shale gas on the margin, right? And that could affect the economics of not only gas, but moving forward into this transition in electric power. So I really, if there are people here who are starting to do this analysis, this is precisely the kind of stuff we're trying to model in this study I mentioned with NREL. We're very interested in what happens with a much more aggressive regulatory approach, a moderate regulatory approach, the current status quo approach, et cetera. But you can imagine there could be considerable costs, right? If suddenly fracking operations become Subtitle C generators under RCRA, right? That's a big deal, right? There's a manifest system, there are requirements, there's permitting, right? If you close some of the loopholes under the Safe Drinking Water Act and suddenly fracking itself is treated under the UIC program, right? That's going to add to the cost. We need information on that. Obviously, the bigger world needs information. It may already exist here at Cornell and in your sort of regional discussions around this, but I think the larger energy policy world is trying to figure this out and figure out what the implications are going forward.
Anyone else want to add? No? Yes, sir.
Yes, earlier we heard the critical nature that pace and intensity plays in what impact natural gas exploration and drilling will have on a region, its economy and its environment. And I just wonder if, given the current price of natural gas and the apparent surplus of natural gas, why it wouldn't make sense for a state like New York to say, okay, you can drill, but it's going to happen slowly. We're going to harvest this resource over the years. We don't need it all today. Let's do it over a period of years. We'll have a lottery by county, and you might have 1 or 2 pads under development in a county like this at one time. It would give us all time to get better at this. It would give communities a chance to respond, and it would taper the boom-bust kind of cycle. So my question would be, why not? Why not pursue that in New York State? Thank you.
I'll just say that the infrastructure development for doing large-scale exploration for hydrocarbons is such that there are economic disincentives to do what you suggest, you know, slow and little at a time and so on. So there are those economic disincentives.
From the industry's point of view?
Yes,
Yeah, correct.
certainly.
Okay.
I'll just say I thought that the keynote speaker's point about you know, how tax revenues could you know, get completely out of whack is a good one. And if there is state law that prohibits localities from, you know, having rainy day funds into which they can put monies during up times that they can draw on during down times like now, that's a fantastic idea. I worked as an economist in Delaware state government, and it made very great use of its rainy day fund. In terms of the pace, I think that as a federalism matter, as a larger sort of structural constitutional issue, I think it is a choice for New York's folks to make what kind of pace they want. You know, I'm not a voter in New York. If I were a voter in New York, particularly given where the economy is, I think I'd probably urge something closer to a free market approach. But if the outcome of the democratic process is that you know, New York shuts it down entirely or New York decides to slow it, I think that's New York's choice. And I think in the interstate competition that will you know, bear itself out. I urge you to look at California, which seems to me to be kind of in a process of like stateside, killing itself with various forms of regulation, and I would urge, you know, other states not to go down that path. But if that's the choice those folks make who live within that state as citizens, I think that's their choice.
Sir.
Oh, it said earlier that most of the fracking would be in Broome and Tioga County, but we're less than an hour away here in Ithaca. So could you address that a little bit, how much hydrofracking would occur in this area? And isn't it true, I mean, that's for Marcellus, but isn't it true there's other layers like Utica and other sandstone layers that they might eventually frack? And potentially, couldn't it be as busy here as Broome and Tioga County? Thank you.
Rick, I can see you edging for this one.
Yeah, this is a geological question. You know, the high probability fairway, as the industry refers to it, is over in Broome and Tioga County for a couple of different reasons, several different reasons. One, there's more total organic carbon in the Marcellus Shale to the east and of here. The Marcellus Shale is also thicker to the east, and it has a more appropriate thermal history to the east. And all of those things go into determining what is a desirable area to drill and what is a not desirable area to drill. Where we're sitting here, the Marcellus is about 2,000 feet below us. It comes to the surface at the northern end of the Finger Lakes and so on, obviously in the town of Marcellus. It's my understanding that kind of the minimum depths which you can even think about doing horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing are on the order of 1,500 feet. And that's because you have to drill vertically through the water table before you can, and case that off before you can start to turn your drill bit horizontally, and it takes a fairly large radius to turn the drill bit horizontally. So that's why people will generally say anywhere where the Marcellus is about on the order of 1,500 feet or shallower. So we're pretty close to the limit of that right here. So it would surprise me greatly if we ever had really extensive development for Marcellus here. The Utica Shale, which you brought up, is a good one. That's getting increasing press. It's beneath the Marcellus. It's older than the Marcellus, but it also has significantly lower total organic carbon than the Marcellus does. And so I don't anticipate that people will start really seriously tapping the Utica either until there's a huge spike in gas prices, and there's no indication in the short term that will happen, or the Marcellus gets tapped out and we start looking for lower grade resources, essentially, because it's essentially a lower grade resource.
Right now, on a national level, we have climate change deniers in positions of authority over U.S. energy policy. And on the one hand, denying climate change helps the fossil fuel industry, yet conversely, the gas companies say natural gas decreases greenhouse gas problems. So my question is, if the new studies are true that show that natural gas may, in fact, increase greenhouse gas problems, how will climate change affect the future of natural gas?
You want me to comment?
Yeah, Jeff.
I had another bit of comments I was going to make, and maybe this is an appropriate time to do it. I think this is one of the reasons why some of the discussion will go on tomorrow as well, which has to do with what we know and don't know. There's no question that the role of fugitive methane could be quite important in offsetting, if you will, some of the other potential benefits of using a lower carbon to hydrogen ratio fuel, such as methane versus coal. Gas also enables the possibility of doing more combined heat and power, more efficient conversion into electricity and heat. But understanding that and understanding what is actually happening in shale gas development is important. There is a history of this in the country, certainly not in the Marcellus to the extent it is in other areas, and we're actually very interested, I think, as let's say investigators, research scientists, environmental scientists, as a group, trying to really get our arms around this and understand what are the effects. This has to do with that underpinning idea of life cycle analysis, but I don't think all of the data are in yet at all on this, and I think we have to be careful. Equally important is the flow back water and other issues that go along with shale gas development, and we should be paying attention, I think, to what's said in the next day or so, because a lot of these issues will be front and center, I believe, Mark, in the way it's put together. So, great question.
The one thing I would add to that is technology is a moving target, and the current technology is particularly unfavorable, at least according to studies by some colleagues at Cornell, one of whom sitting down here in the second row, to the current way that hydrofracking is done. But there are other technologies where hydrofracking can be done differently, which apparently, and we don't really know, but which apparently can result in much lower fugitive methane loss.